The Idaho State Penitentiary was a functioning prison from 1872 to 1973, less than 2 miles southeast of the capital. The first building, called the Territorial Prison, was built on this spot 7 years before the prison was built, and 20 years before Idaho became a state. What began as a single-cell house grew to a complex of several buildings surrounded by a 17-foot sandstone wall. The resident convicts quarried the stone and also assisted in the construction of the prison. Let's take a closer look at the timeline of the prison's layout. The Territorial Prison was completed in 1872 and received its first 11 inmates from the Boise County Jail. The building was converted into a chapel in the 1930s and was destroyed by fire in the 1973 riot. The new cell house was constructed in 1890 and consisted of 3 tiers of 42 steel cells. The third tier, closest to the Rose Garden, served as death row. The area now known as the Rose Garden was once used to execute prisoners by hanging. Of the 10 executions at the old state penitentiary, 6 occurred here. The administration building was completed in 1894 and housed the warden's office, armory, visitation room, control room, and turnkey area. The false front building was completed in 1895 and held the commissary, trustee dorm, barber shop from 1902 to the 1960s, and the blacksmith shop until 1912. In 1912, it was remodeled and became a prison hospital until the 1960s. The hospital was then converted into the social services office but burned down in the 1971 riot. The dining hall was built in 1898 and was designed by one of the inmates of the prison by the name of George Hamilton. The dining hall burned down in the 1973 riot. Cell House 2, also known as the North Wing, was completed in 1899. It contained 2-man cells. A honey bucket was placed in each cell to serve as a toilet. Inmates burned the building in the 1973 riot. Cell House 3 was also completed in 1899 and was built the same as Cell House 2. It was eventually condemned for habitation, but in 1921 was converted into a shoe factory. In 1928, the building was remodeled for inmate occupancy and became the first cell house with indoor plumbing. The men's ward dormitory was completed in 1920 and was built out of necessity. Prior to its completion, the women moved into the warden's old house in 1905. Previously, women did not have separate quarters, and several scandals forced their relocation. Male inmates built a wall around the old warden's home in 1906 to serve as a separate facility for women. This building had 7 two-person cells, a central day room, kitchen, and bathroom facilities. The multipurpose building was built by inmates in 1923. It served as a shirt factory, shoe shop, bakery, license plate shop, laundry, hobby room, loafing room, and housed the communal showers. Solitary confinement consisted of 2 sections. The first, built in the early 1920s, was the cooler. Although built for solitary confinement, each cell contained 4 to 6 men. The second section, known as Siberia, was built in 1926 and housed 12 3-by-8-foot cells with 1 inmate per cell. Cell House 4 was built in 1952 and was the largest and most modern cell house at the penitentiary. Some inmates painted their cells and left drawings on the walls that can be seen today. Cell House 5 was built in 1954 and was the maximum security ward of the prison. This is where the most unruly and violent offenders stayed. The building also served as a permanent place for solitary confinement. It includes a built-in gallows and even a death row. There is also an indoor recreation area that is now the Idaho Botanical Gardens, where inmates boxed and played many sports. The prison cemetery is located in the Botanical Gardens. There were a few famous inmates at Idaho State Penitentiary. One was Harry Orchard, who assassinated the former governor of Idaho in 1905. There was Lyda Southard, also known as Lady Bluebeard, who murdered several of her husbands to collect their life insurance. Then there is Raymond Snowden, Often referred to as Idaho's Jack the Ripper, he was the last person executed in the state before a U.S. Supreme Court decision was passed in 1972 banning capital punishment. Out of the 130 reported deaths at the prison, 10 were executions. All were done by hanging. But there was only one inmate buried within the walls of the prison: Dennis. Dennis was a cat that was found as a kitten in the prison barn by an inmate in 1952. The inmates as well as the guards grew to love Dennis, and Dennis lived for 16 years at the prison, until he died in his sleep in 1968. The inmates had a funeral for him and even provided a headstone. Serious riots occurred in 1952, 1971, and 1973 over the living conditions at the prison. Finally, the 416 remaining inmates were transported to Idaho State Correctional, and the Idaho State Penitentiary was closed on December 3rd, 1973. The prison became part of the National Record of Historic Places in 1974, and is now a museum run by the Idaho State Historical Society. There are artifacts here from as far back as 1000 BC. Now we know that all prisons are haunted, but have these Bronze Age items come to enhance the paranormal activity here? Or are we just prisoners of our own imagination?